The ducal estate stood in austere silence, its towering stone walls untouched by warmth or laughter, as though the very air had learned to hold its breath. Within its vast halls lived Duke Alaric, a man of only 24 years, yet already burdened with a reputation as cold and unyielding as winter frost. Servants moved like shadows, speaking only when necessary, careful not to disturb the rigid order he maintained. Nothing in the estate existed without purpose, and nothing lingered longer than required. It was into this carefully controlled world that Lady arrived, her presence as quiet and uncertain as a flickering candle in an empty room. At 22, carried herself with a fragile grace that hinted at a gentler past, though hardship had dulled its shine. Her clothes were simple, her posture reserved, and her voice barely above a whisper when she introduced herself. She had not come seeking favor, nor had she been welcomed with any ceremony. Instead, her arrival was the result of obligation, a forgotten connection between families that left the Duke no choice but to allow her temporary stay. Yet even that allowance came with limits, clearly defined and devoid of kindness, as though compassion itself had no place within these walls. Alaric first saw her in passing, offering nothing more than a brief, indifferent glance. To him she was merely another responsibility to be managed and dismissed. He neither questioned her circumstances nor cared to understand them. The past had taught him that involvement led only to complications, and so he kept his distance, maintaining the emotional barriers that had long protected him. When informed of her presence, he simply issued a single, his tone clipped and final, "Just cook dinner tonight, then go." There was no room for negotiation, no trace of curiosity, only the expectation of obedience. Accepted the instruction without protest, though her hands trembled slightly as she made her way to the unfamiliar kitchen. The servants watched her with quiet curiosity, unused to seeing anyone step into their roles without direction, yet she required none. Moving with careful precision, she began preparing the evening meal, her actions practiced and deliberate. Cooking for her was more than a task, it was a refuge, a place where control replaced uncertainty. Each measured movement seemed to steady her, as though the act itself anchored her to something reliable in a life that had offered little stability. As the hours passed, subtle details revealed themselves to those who cared to notice. Flinched at the sound of a dropped utensil, her breath catching before she quickly composed herself. She kept her sleeves drawn low even in the warmth of the kitchen and avoided unnecessary contact with others. When a servant offered assistance, she declined with quiet urgency as though proximity itself posed a risk. These small, fleeting moments went largely unspoken, absorbed into the silence that defined the estate, yet they painted a picture far more complex than her subdued demeanor suggested. When dinner was finally served, the dining hall felt as cold as ever, its vast space swallowing sound and presence alike. Alaric sat alone at the long table, his expression unreadable as dishes were placed before him. He did not acknowledge the effort, nor did he expect to be impressed. Meals to him were functional necessities devoid of pleasure or sentiment. Yet as he took the first bite, something unexpected stirred, a subtle shift in perception he could not immediately name. The flavors were balanced, deliberate, crafted with care rather than obligation, and for a fleeting moment he paused. Stood at a distance, waiting only long enough to ensure her task was complete before preparing to leave, just as instructed. Her gaze remained lowered, her presence deliberately small, as though she sought to vanish before drawing attention. It might have ended there, another silent exchange in a house built on distance, had it not been for the soft flicker of candlelight that caught against her arm. The movement was slight, almost imperceptible, yet it revealed what she had tried so carefully to conceal, darkened bruises, stark against her pale skin. Alaric's gaze sharpened instantly, the stillness around him shifting into something far more focused. He had seen injuries before, understood the marks left by hardship and conflict, but this was different. These were not accidents, nor were they the result of clumsy misfortune. They told a quieter, more deliberate story, one of pain endured without witness or defense. For the first time since her arrival, he looked at not as an obligation, but as a question demanding an answer he had not intended to seek. "Stop," he said, his voice cutting cleanly through the silence as she turned to leave. The word was not loud, yet it carried a weight that halted her immediately. Froze, her breath unsteady as though she had been caught in something she could not escape. Slowly she turned back, her expression carefully composed, though the tension in her posture betrayed her unease. She did not speak, nor did she meet his eyes, waiting instead for whatever judgment or dismissal might follow. For a moment neither of them moved. The distance between them, once defined by indifference, now felt charged with something far more uncertain. Alaric rose from his seat, his movements measured as he stepped closer, his gaze fixed on the marks that had shattered his detachment. Up close they were impossible to ignore, their severity contradicting the quiet composure she maintained. Something within him shifted, subtle yet undeniable, as though a long-sealed door had been forced open without warning. "What happened?" he asked, his tone lower now, stripped of its earlier dismissal yet still firm enough to demand truth. It was not a question he asked lightly, nor one he expected to matter. Yet as the words left him, he realized they carried a weight he could not take back. Hesitated, her fingers tightening at her sides, the silence stretching between them as she considered whether to answer. For the first time, the he had given no longer defined the moment, replaced instead by something far more fragile and uncertain. And in that hesitation, the carefully ordered world of the cold Duke began quietly to change. Did not answer at once, and the silence that followed seemed to press in from every corner of the vast dining hall. Her fingers tightened against the fabric of her dress as though she might anchor herself to something steady, yet no such comfort existed in this moment. She had learned through long and bitter experience that truth often came at a cost she could not afford. To speak was to risk disbelief, dismissal, or worse, and yet the Duke's gaze remained fixed, unwavering in a way that made evasion feel impossible. "It is nothing, Your Grace," she said finally, her voice soft but carefully controlled. The words were practiced, shaped by habit rather than honesty, and she lowered her eyes as though that alone might end the inquiry. It had always been enough before. "It is not nothing," Alaric replied, his tone steady though something beneath it had shifted. He did not raise his voice, nor did he step back. Instead, he remained where he stood, close enough to see the faint tremor she could no longer conceal. Those marks were not made by chance. Drew a slow breath, her composure wavering for a fraction of a second before she forced it back into place. "It does not concern you," she said, the quiet firmness in her words more revealing than any explanation. It was not defiance, but resignation, the kind that came from knowing her circumstances were not hers to change. Alaric studied her in silence, recognizing the familiar barrier she had raised. He had seen it before in others who had learned to survive by withholding truth, but rarely had it unsettled him as it did now. Perhaps it was the contrast between her fragile appearance and the quiet endurance she displayed, or perhaps it was the simple fact that she stood alone with no one to speak on her behalf. Whatever the reason, he found himself unwilling to accept her answer. "Everything within these walls concerns me," he said at last, his voice calm yet absolute. "You were brought here under my authority. That makes your condition my concern, whether you believe it or not." The words were not unkind, yet they left little room for refusal. Hesitated again, her thoughts caught between instinct and something far more uncertain. She had expected indifference, perhaps even dismissal, but not this measured insistence. It unsettled her more than harshness would have. "There is nothing to be done," she said quietly, though the certainty in her voice had begun to fracture. "It is already past." Alaric's expression hardened slightly, though not in anger. "That is not an answer," he said, "and it is not acceptable." For a moment it seemed she might retreat entirely, closing herself off as she had been taught to do. Her gaze shifted toward the door as though calculating the distance, the possibility of escape. But she did not move. Instead, she remained where she was, held not by force but by something she could not yet name. "They were not mine to avoid," she said at last, the words barely above a whisper, "nor mine to question." The admission lingered in the air, incomplete yet unmistakable in its meaning. Alaric did not interrupt, sensing that any attempt to rush her would drive her back into silence. He waited, his patience deliberate, giving her the space to continue or withdraw. "I was placed in a household after my father's passing," went on, her voice steadying as she spoke, though her eyes remained fixed on the floor. "It was said to be a kindness, a means of ensuring I would not be left without support." A faint, humorless breath escaped her. Kindness, however, is often defined by those who have no need of it. Alaric's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but he said nothing. "At first it was tolerable," she continued. "I was given duties expected to earn my place. That alone would not have been difficult, but over time expectations changed. Small mistakes were no longer overlooked. Silence was demanded, not requested. And when silence was not enough," she paused, her hand shifting slightly as though she had forgotten to keep it still. The unspoken conclusion settled heavily between them. "You endured this without protest," Alaric said, not as a question but as a statement he needed confirmed. His lips pressed together briefly before she answered. "Protest requires someone willing to listen," she said. "There was no such person." The simplicity of her response carried more weight than any elaborate explanation could have. It was not bitterness that defined her words, but a quiet acceptance that spoke of prolonged suffering. Alaric exhaled slowly, the measured control he maintained now directed toward something far more deliberate. "And they allowed you to leave?" he asked. "I was sent," she corrected gently. "When it became inconvenient to keep me, your household was mentioned as an alternative." Understanding settled into place with unsettling clarity. She had not been offered refuge out of goodwill, but rather discarded when she no longer served a purpose. The realization did not surprise him, yet it stirred a cold, focused anger that he did not immediately reveal. "You will not return there," he said, the certainty in his voice leaving no room for negotiation. Looked up then, her composure faltering in genuine surprise. "That is not for me to decide," she said quickly. "My presence here was already more than I had reason to expect. I will not impose further." "You misunderstand," Alaric replied, his tone firm though not unkind. "This is no longer a matter of expectation. It is a matter of decision, and the decision is mine." She hesitated, uncertainty clouding her expression. Your Grace, I cannot remain indefinitely, it would be improper, and I. You will remain, he said, cutting gently through her protest without raising his voice. Not as a burden and not as a temporary inconvenience. You will remain because I will not permit what has already occurred to continue. The quiet authority in his words left little room for argument, yet it was not that she had expected. There was no dismissal in it, no distance. Instead, there was something steadier, something that unsettled her far more than indifference ever had. Lowered her gaze once more, her thoughts uncertain, her instincts urging caution even as something within her began, cautiously, to hope. And for the first time since she had entered the estate, the possibility of staying no longer felt like something to fear. Days passed in a manner that felt unfamiliar to not because of hardship, but because of its absence. The ducal estate, once suffocating in its silence, began to shift in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. Servants no longer avoided the sound of footsteps as if it were a warning, and the rigid stillness that had defined the halls softened into something quieter, less oppressive. At the center of this change stood not only the Duke, but herself, though she remained unaware of the extent of her influence. She settled into a routine that did not demand fear. Mornings were spent in the kitchen or overseeing small household matters, tasks she approached with careful diligence rather than urgency. No one raised their voice when she made a mistake, and no punishment followed minor missteps. At first, she waited for it, her body conditioned to anticipate reprimand, but none came. The absence of cruelty felt as disorienting as its presence once had. Alaric observed these changes without comment, though his awareness of never truly receded. He found himself adjusting small details without conscious thought, ensuring she had what she needed before she could ask. A physician was summoned under the pretense of routine care, though the careful attention given to her injuries betrayed his true intent. Proper clothing replaced the worn garments she had arrived in, chosen not for display but for comfort. Each action was measured, deliberate, and entirely unfamiliar to a man who had once considered such considerations unnecessary. Their interactions remained restrained, yet no longer distant. Meals became the point at which their separate routines intersected, and what had once been a silent obligation transformed into something steadier. No longer stood at the far end of the room waiting for dismissal. Instead, she was invited quietly without ceremony to sit. The first time it happened, she hesitated, certain she had misunderstood, but Alaric did not repeat himself. He simply waited, his expectation clear in the stillness. Conversation did not come easily at first. Words felt fragile, as though they might disrupt the tenuous balance they had begun to establish. Yet over time, silence lost its weight. It became something shared rather than imposed, a space in which neither felt compelled to retreat. Spoke in small increments, offering pieces of herself with cautious intent, while Alaric listened with a patience that surprised even him. You prepare each dish as though it matters, he said one evening, his tone thoughtful rather than critical. Lowered her gaze slightly, considering her answer. It is one thing I can do without uncertainty, she replied. When something is made with care, it does not betray you. The statement lingered, its meaning extending beyond the simplicity of the task. Alaric did not respond immediately, but the insight did not go unnoticed. In time he began to speak as well, though not in the manner others might expect. He did not offer long explanations or detailed confessions. Instead, his past revealed itself in fragments, each one carefully chosen. He spoke of responsibility assumed too early, of alliances that had proven unreliable, and of decisions that required distance rather than trust. There was no self-pity in his words, only acknowledgement. Dependence invites weakness, he said once, his voice even, and weakness is rarely forgiven. Studied him quietly, recognizing the belief not as arrogance but as something learned. Perhaps, she said after a moment, but isolation invites emptiness. That too is not easily endured. Her response was gentle, yet it carried a quiet certainty that caused him to pause. It was not disagreement, but neither was it acceptance. It was something else entirely, an alternative he had not considered worth examining. As the days turned into weeks, the estate continued to change. Light seemed to linger longer in its corridors, and the once muted atmosphere gave way to something more alive. Servants spoke with less hesitation, their movements less constrained by fear of misstep. The transformation was gradual but undeniable, and it centered around the presence of two individuals who had once existed entirely apart from one another. Yet not all change came without consequence. Became increasingly aware of her position, not within the estate but beyond it. Though no one spoke of it directly, she understood the expectations that surrounded a man of Alaric's standing. His life was not his own to shape without consideration, and her presence, however quiet, could not remain without scrutiny. You have already done more than I had any right to expect, she said one evening, her voice measured, though her hands remained still in her lap. It would be unreasonable to assume that this arrangement can continue without question. Alaric regarded her steadily, recognizing the shift in her tone. Is that your concern, he asked, or something you believe should be mine? It is both, she replied. Your position requires more than personal preference. I would not have my presence complicate what must remain uncompromised. Her words were careful, yet they carried an unmistakable distance, as though she had begun to withdraw before being asked to do so. Alaric recognized it immediately, the same instinctive retreat he had seen before, though now it unsettled him in a way it had not before. "You presume a great deal about what I consider necessary," he said, his voice calm but firmer than before. "And you presume I would remain where I am not meant to be," she answered softly. The exchange left no room for easy resolution, and for the first time since her arrival, a quiet tension settled between them. It was not born of misunderstanding, but of truths neither had fully confronted. That night lingered longer than usual in the quiet corridors, her thoughts unsettled despite the calm surroundings. She had found something she had not expected, safety, perhaps even belonging, but the possibility of losing it felt too familiar to ignore. Better to leave by choice than to wait until she no longer had won. And though no decision was spoken aloud, the distance she had begun to place between herself and the life she had come to know did not go unnoticed. The decision once formed settled heavily in his mind, yet she carried it with a quiet resolve that concealed its weight. By morning, her demeanor had returned to its usual composure, though a subtle distance marked her movements. She completed her tasks with the same care as before, spoke when necessary, and avoided anything that might draw attention to the shift within her. If anyone noticed, they did not speak of it. The estate continued its gentle rhythm, unaware that its fragile balance stood on the edge of change. Alaric, however, was not unaware. He recognized the difference not in what she did, but in what she, where once there had been a cautious openness, there was now restraint. Her words were fewer, her presence more fleeting, as though she had begun to recede into the very silence she had helped dispel. It was a familiar pattern, one he had seen in others who prepared themselves for departure long before it was required. He did not confront her immediately. Instead, he observed, allowing certainty to replace assumption. Yet with each passing day, the distance grew more defined until it could no longer be dismissed as imagination or coincidence. When he entered the dining hall that evening, he found her already there, standing beside the table rather than seated as she had been invited to do. The sight alone confirmed what he had begun to suspect. "You are leaving," he said, not as a question, but as a conclusion drawn from careful observation. Did not deny it, she inclined her head slightly, her expression composed despite the tension that lingered beneath it. "It is the most appropriate course," she replied. "I have remained longer than intended. It would be unwise to assume such leniency can continue without consequence." Alaric studied her for a moment, his gaze steady. "And you believe departure will resolve what you consider a complication?" "I believe it will prevent one," she answered. The distinction was deliberate, yet it did not alter the outcome she intended. Alaric moved closer, his presence measured but unmistakable. "You speak as though your presence here is a liability," he said. "That is not a conclusion I have reached." "It is not yours alone to consider," replied, her voice calm though quieter than before. "Your position demands certain expectations. I would not have my presence undermine them." "You presume that expectation outweighs judgment," he said. "And you presume it does not," she returned, meeting his gaze for the first time since the conversation began. "We are both aware that such matters are rarely left to personal preference." The honesty in her words left little room for dismissal. She was not mistaken in her understanding of the world beyond these walls, nor in the limitations it imposed. Yet Alaric found himself unwilling to accept the conclusion she had drawn from it. "Then perhaps it is time that preference is no longer ignored," he said, his tone quieter now, though no less certain. Hesitated, the shift in his voice catching her off guard. "Your Grace." "Alaric," he interrupted, the correction deliberate. "If you are to speak of my life as though you understand its constraints, then you may at least address me without distance." The request unsettled her more than command would have. For a moment she said nothing, her composure wavering under the weight of something she had not anticipated. "You have already altered this household," he continued, his voice steady as he closed the remaining distance between them. "Not through obligation nor through expectation, but through presence alone. You speak of leaving as though your absence will return everything to its proper order. It will not." "That is not reason enough for me to remain," she said, though her certainty had begun to falter. "No," he agreed, "it is not." The admission hung between them, unexpected in its simplicity, drew a slow breath as though bracing herself for what would follow. "I did not ask you to stay because it was convenient," he said, "nor because I felt obligated to offer you refuge. I asked because I chose to." Her gaze shifted slightly, uncertainty replacing the quiet resolve she had carried until now. "Choice does not always endure," she said softly. "Circumstances change, expectations." "Then let them," he said, the calm firmness of his voice cutting through her hesitation. "I have spent years shaping my life according to what was required, what was expected, and what was deemed necessary by those who held no understanding of its cost. I will not continue to do so where it no longer serves purpose." searched his expression as though trying to discern whether his words were driven by impulse or something steadier. And what of when it does? She asked. What of when the cost becomes unavoidable? Then it will be faced, he replied, but not by surrendering before it demands to be paid. The certainty in his response left no room for doubt. It was not defiance for its own sake, nor was it born of fleeting sentiment. It was a decision, deliberate and unwavering. You speak as though this is simple, she said, though her voice had softened. It is not simple, he answered, but neither is it uncertain. For a moment silence returned, though it no longer carried the weight it once had. Lowered her gaze briefly, her thoughts shifting as the resolve she had carefully constructed began to unravel. I do not know how to remain where I am not merely tolerated, she admitted, the words quiet but unguarded, nor how to trust that such a place will not be taken from me. Alaric regarded her steadily, recognizing the truth in her uncertainty. Then you will learn, he said, not because you are required to, but because you are no longer alone in doing so. The simplicity of the statement carried more reassurance than any elaborate promise could have offered. It did not deny difficulty, nor did it dismiss the past that had shaped her hesitation. Instead, it acknowledged both, while offering something she had not expected to receive. Exhaled slowly, the tension in her posture easing as the certainty she had clung to gave way to something quieter, yet no less resolute. And if I choose to stay, she said carefully, it will not be because I have nowhere else to go. No, Alaric replied, it will be because you wish to. The distinction settled between them, clear and undeniable. For the first time since her arrival, the decision before her did not feel like an escape, but a beginning. And as the silence returned once more, it no longer felt like something to endure, but something shared, steady, and unbroken.